The rain lashed against the windows of the old Kerrigan estate, the wind howling through the towering trees that lined the property. Inside, the dimly lit parlor was filled with uneasy silence. Margaret Kerrigan, the family matriarch, sat in her velvet armchair, her sharp blue eyes scanning the faces of her gathered relatives. Her frail hands trembled, not from age, but from fury. "It was here last night," she said, her voice laced with quiet menace. "And this morning, it was gone." On the polished mahogany table before her, the empty velvet box gaped like an open wound. The Kerrigan heirloom, an antique sapphire pendant that had been in the family for generations, had vanished. Her children and grandchildren exchanged uneasy glances. One of them had taken it, and if there was one thing Margaret knew, it was that secrets never stayed buried for long in Mourne Heights. Claire Murphy had been forewarned about the infamous Kerrigan dinner invitations. In the 4 months since she and Sean had moved to Mourne Heights, they'd received 3 such invitations, each with increasing insistence. "The summons has arrived," Sean announced, waving an embossed cream envelope as he entered their kitchen. "Margaret Kerrigan requests our presence this Friday evening. Formal attire required." Claire looked up from her laptop where she'd been cataloging recent art acquisitions for the National Gallery. "That's the 4th invitation. I'm beginning to think we can't avoid it any longer." Sean sighed, setting the envelope on the counter. "Margaret Kerrigan doesn't invite people, she collects them. Every new resident of a certain social standing in Mourne Heights eventually becomes another specimen in her collection." "Is that what happened with the McKeevers?" Claire asked, thinking of their former neighbors whose public implosion had been the talk of Newcastle for months. "Actually, no. The Kerrigans and McKeevers maintained a polite rivalry. Old money versus new," Sean explained, reaching for the coffee pot. "The McKeevers were doctors and business people who made their fortune in the last 50 years. The Kerrigans have owned half of County Down since the 1800s. Claire closed her laptop, intrigued despite her reservations. She'd spent enough time in Mourne Heights now to understand its intricate social hierarchies, but the Kerrigans remained somewhat mysterious. Their sprawling Victorian estate sat at the highest point of the neighborhood, partially obscured by ancient oak trees and surrounded by immaculately maintained gardens. "What do we know about them?" she asked. Sean leaned against the counter, considering. "Margaret is the widow of James Kerrigan, who was something of a legend in shipping and international trade. 3 children, all middle-aged now. Catherine's a high-powered attorney in Belfast. Robert manages what's left of the family business, and Fiona is the family rebel, an artist who spends more time abroad than in Newcastle." "And the grandchildren?" "2 that I know of. Liam, Catherine's son, works at his mother's law firm but doesn't have her drive or talent, according to hospital gossip. And Ava, Robert's daughter, who's constantly in the society pages for all the wrong reasons." Claire contemplated the invitation again. "So why us? We're hardly Newcastle royalty." "New blood," Sean suggested with a wry smile. "After the McKeever scandal, Margaret probably sees an opportunity to establish her family as the undisputed social leaders of Mourne Heights. Having a respected surgeon and art conservator at her dinner table adds to her collection of influential connections." "Do we have a legitimate excuse to decline?" Claire asked hopefully. Sean checked his phone calendar. "I'm off call this weekend, and you've just told me you've finished the museum cataloging." Claire sighed in defeat. "Then I suppose we're having dinner with the Kerrigans." Friday evening arrived with weather befitting a Gothic novel, driving rain and wind that bent the trees along Slieve Donard Avenue. Claire and Sean pulled through the wrought iron gates of the Kerrigan estate, following a winding gravel drive that led to an imposing Victorian mansion. Built of dark gray stone, with elaborate turrets and gables, Thornfield Hall, as it was ostentatiously named, loomed against the stormy sky like something from a Bronte story. "Cheerful," Claire commented as they parked behind a sleek Jaguar. "Wait until you meet the family," Sean replied, retrieving an umbrella from the back seat. They dashed through the rain to a massive oak door, flanked by stained glass panels. Before they could knock, the door swung open to reveal a tall, thin man in formal attire. "Dr. and Mrs. Murphy," he intoned with practiced precision. "Mrs. Watt Kerrigan is expecting you. Follow me, please." The interior of Thornfield Hall was exactly what Claire had expected: ornate, traditional, and ostentatiously wealthy. Oil portraits lined wood-paneled hallways, crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings, and antique furniture stood strategically placed on Persian carpets. The effect was less a home than a museum of family prosperity. Their guide led them through a series of interconnected rooms before arriving at a large drawing room where several people stood in small conversational clusters, drinks in hand. At the center of the room, seated regally in a high-backed chair that resembled a throne, sat Margaret Kerrigan. Even in her 80s, Margaret maintained a commanding presence. Her silver hair was arranged in an elegant coiffure, her posture was ramrod straight, and her ice-blue eyes missed nothing. She wore a deep navy dress with a high collar, and around her neck hung a stunning sapphire pendant that caught the light from the chandelier above. "Dr. Murphy," Margaret called, her voice carrying easily across the room. "And Mrs. Murphy, how good of you to finally accept my invitation." The subtle emphasis on finally wasn't lost on Claire as they approached the matriarch. "Mrs. Kerrigan," Sean replied with practiced deference. "Thank you for your hospitality. May I introduce my wife, Claire?" Margaret's penetrating gaze shifted to Claire, assessing everything from her emerald cocktail dress to her subtle makeup. "An art conservator, I understand. The National Gallery in Dublin is fortunate to have you, even on a consulting basis." Claire wasn't surprised that Margaret had researched her. "That's very kind. Your home contains some remarkable pieces. Is that a William Scott in the hallway?" Margaret's thin lips curved into an appreciative smile. "Indeed it is. Perhaps after dinner I'll show you some of our more significant works." James had quite the eye for emerging Irish artists. A server appeared with a tray of champagne, and Sean smoothly procured 2 glasses, handing one to Claire. "Let me introduce you to the family," Margaret continued, gesturing to a tall, elegant woman approaching them. "My eldest, Catherine." Catherine Kerrigan had her mother's commanding presence, though her dark hair and warm brown eyes must have come from her father. She wore a tailored black dress that screamed expensive simplicity, and her handshake was firm and brief. "Dr. Murphy," she acknowledged Sean, then turned to Claire. "Mrs. Murphy, Mother has spoken quite highly of you both. Call me Claire, please." "Catherine is one of Belfast's most formidable attorneys," Margaret explained with evident pride. "Senior partner at Kerrigan, Walsh and Associates. Estate law," Catherine added, "though I dabble in corporate matters when necessary." "And that sulking young man by the fireplace is her son, Liam," Margaret continued, nodding toward a handsome but disheveled man in his early 30s, who seemed more interested in his phone than the gathering around him. As if sensing their attention, Liam looked up and offered a half-hearted wave before returning to his screen. "You'll have to forgive my son," Catherine said, her tone cooling noticeably. "Social obligations aren't his strong suit." Before the awkwardness could deepen, they were approached by a stocky, red-faced man with thinning gray hair and an expensive but poorly fitting suit. "Robert Kerrigan," he introduced himself, pumping Sean's hand enthusiastically. "Good to have some new blood in the neighborhood. Those McKeevers were getting tiresome, weren't they? Tragic business, all that scandal." "Robert," Margaret reprimanded sharply, "we don't discuss the misfortunes of others at social gatherings." Robert's face flushed deeper, but he quickly recovered. "Of course, Mother. Forgive me. Claire, was it? Delightful dress. Matches your eyes." Claire smiled politely, recognizing the slightly excessive warmth in Robert's manner as the effect of several pre-dinner drinks. "And where is Ava?" Margaret asked, glancing around the room with evident disapproval. "Running late as usual," Robert replied with forced joviality. "You know my daughter, always making an entrance." "And Fiona?" Margaret's tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Called from Paris an hour ago," Robert said. "Sends her regrets. Something about an exhibition opening she couldn't miss." Margaret's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "How convenient. Well, we shall have to manage without her. Again." The tension in the room shifted subtly, and Claire caught a brief exchange of glances between Catherine and Robert that suggested this was a common source of family friction. A commotion at the door drew their attention as a young woman swept into the room, shedding a rain-spattered coat, which she handed carelessly to the waiting staff member. Tall and willowy, with dramatic black hair cut in a sharp bob, she wore a red dress that would have been more appropriate for a nightclub than a family dinner. "Sorry I'm late, grandmother," she called, crossing the room to place an air kiss near Margaret's cheek. "Absolute nightmare getting a car in this weather." "Ava," Margaret acknowledged coldly, "you're 45 minutes late. We've been entertaining our guests without you." Ava turned, noticing Claire and Sean for the first time. "Oh, new faces. How utterly thrilling." She extended a hand adorned with several ostentatious rings. "Ava Kerrigan, the family disappointment if you listen to grandmother." "Dr. Sean Murphy," Sean replied, accepting her hand with professional courtesy, "and my wife, Claire." "The new neighbors from Sleve Donard Avenue," Ava said, her eyes lighting with recognition. "Living in the old McKeever house, aren't you? Brave souls." "Dinner is served," announced the staff member who had greeted them at the door, providing a timely interruption. As they followed Margaret toward the dining room, Claire caught sight of the sapphire pendant glinting at the matriarch's throat. Even to Claire's trained eye, it was a remarkable piece, a large, cushion-cut sapphire surrounded by diamonds in an intricate platinum setting that suggested early 20th century craftsmanship. The dining room matched the grandeur of the rest of the house, with a massive mahogany table set for 8, crystal glasses catching the light from another impressive chandelier, and heavy velvet drapes drawn against the stormy night. A fire crackled in a marble fireplace, providing a welcome warmth against the chill that seemed to permeate the old house despite its modern heating system. Claire found herself seated between Robert and Liam, with Sean across from her beside Catherine. Margaret presided at the head of the table, with Ava at the opposite end, a placement that seemed designed to keep the unpredictable granddaughter as far from the matriarch as possible. "The weather is positively biblical tonight," Robert commented, as servers presented the first course, a delicate crab bisque. "Reminds me of the storm in '87, doesn't it, Mother? The one that took down the old oak tree." "Indeed," Margaret replied. "Though that storm was in '86, Robert. Your memory continues to be selectively unreliable." Robert's smile faltered, and he reached quickly for his wine glass. Claire turned to Liam, hoping to draw the taciturn young man into conversation. "I understand you work with your mother at her law firm?" Liam looked up from his soup, seeming surprised to be addressed directly. "Junior partner," he clarified, with a hint of defensiveness, though junior is something of a misnomer after 8 years. "Liam handles our smaller clients," Catherine interjected from across the table, "building experience before taking on more significant cases." The subtle undermining wasn't lost on Claire, nor was the flash of resentment that crossed Liam's face. "And you, Ava?" Sean asked politely. "What keeps you occupied?" Ava's laugh was musical but hollow. "Besides spending the family fortune, I dabble in event planning, charity galas, society weddings, that sort of thing." "Ava organized the Newcastle Children's Hospital benefit last month," Catherine offered, surprising Claire with this unexpected defense of her niece. "Raised over £50,000, which almost covers what she spent on that ridiculous sports car," Robert muttered, just loud enough to be heard. "Now, Robert," Margaret chided, "let's not discuss finances at dinner. It's vulgar." She turned to Sean. "Dr. Murphy, I understand you've taken over Dr. McKeever's patients since his departure from practice." Sean nodded, accepting the delicate shift in conversation. "Some of them, yes. The cardiac department has distributed his patient load among several surgeons." "Such a shocking business," Margaret commented, touching the sapphire pendant absently. "One never truly knows what goes on behind closed doors, does one?" The comment hung in the air, laden with implication. Claire glanced around the table, noting the various reactions. Catherine's careful neutrality, Robert's poorly concealed discomfort, Liam's studied indifference, and Ava's barely suppressed amusement. "Speaking of shocking," Ava said, leaning forward with mischievous intent, "did anyone see the latest about the Wilson divorce? Edward apparently had accounts in the Caymans that even his lawyer didn't know about." "Ava," Margaret's voice cut like a whip. "What did I just say about discussing the misfortunes of others? But it's not a misfortune, grandmother. It's karma. Everyone knows Edward Wilson has been hiding money for years. Amelia's finally getting what she deserves." And how would you know what Edward Wilson has or hasn't been hiding? Catherine asked, her lawyer's instinct for weakness emerging. Ava smiled enigmatically. Newcastle is a small town, dear aunt. People talk, especially to someone they don't take seriously. The undercurrents of family tension were becoming increasingly apparent, and Claire exchanged a quick glance with Sean, confirming he was also sensing the strained atmosphere beneath the veneer of family togetherness. As dinner progressed through a main course of perfectly prepared rack of lamb and a dessert of creme brulee, Claire observed the Kerrigan dynamics with growing fascination. Margaret ruled the table with iron control, redirecting conversation when it veered into uncomfortable territory, and discreetly managing her family's behavior with subtle glances and pointed comments. By the time they retired to the drawing room for coffee, Claire had witnessed at least a dozen silent exchanges laden with unspoken meaning between various family members. Whatever presentation the Kerrigans were putting on for their guests, it was clear that significant tensions simmered beneath the surface. "Claire," Margaret called, gesturing to the space beside her on a damask settee. "Come sit with me. I'm eager to hear more about your work." As Claire obliged, the sapphire pendant caught her eye again. Up close, it was even more magnificent. The deep blue stone had remarkable clarity and an unusual depth of color. "You're admiring my pendant," Margaret observed, her shrewd eyes missing nothing. "It's beautiful," Claire acknowledged. "Early Art Deco, isn't it?" Margaret's thin fingers touched the jewel with evident affection. 1913, to be precise. My husband's grandfather commissioned it for his bride from a jeweler in Vienna. The sapphire itself is cashmere, 19 carats and completely natural. No heat treatment. Claire's eyebrows raised. A 19-carat cashmere sapphire of that quality would be worth millions. "It's been passed down through the Kerrigan women for generations," Margaret continued, "a symbol of the family's endurance and strength." "It's spectacular," Claire said sincerely. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary." "Yes, well," Margaret's voice dropped slightly. "Beauty often conceals complexity, doesn't it? Much like families." Before Claire could respond to this cryptic comment, a crash from across the room drew their attention. Ava had apparently bumped into a server, sending a tray of coffee cups shattering to the floor. "For God's sake, Ava," Catherine snapped. "Are you drunk again?" "It was an accident," Ava retorted, her voice rising. "Unlike your personality, which is deliberately unpleasant." "Enough!" Margaret's command silenced the room. "Ava, go and compose yourself. Catherine, please remember we have guests." As staff quickly cleared the broken china, an uncomfortable silence fell over the gathering. Sean caught Claire's eye with a subtle tilt of his head toward the door, a clear signal that perhaps they should make their exit soon. Robert, seemingly eager to dispel the tension, approached with forced cheerfulness. "Dr. Murphy, I've been meaning to ask about that new cardiac procedure I read about in the papers. Something about minimally invasive valve replacements?" As Sean engaged with Robert, Claire noticed Liam slip quietly from the room, his expression troubled. A moment later, Ava also disappeared, though with considerably less discretion, her departure marked by the sharp click of high heels on marble flooring. "You must forgive my grandchildren," Margaret said to Claire, her voice steady despite the evident strain in her features. "They're still learning the importance of decorum." "Family gatherings can be complicated," Claire offered diplomatically. Margaret's piercing gaze settled on her. "Indeed. And yet they reveal so much about who we truly are, don't they? Under pressure, our essential natures emerge." The evening concluded shortly thereafter, with Claire and Sean making their excuses after the appropriate interval had passed. As they retrieved their coats, Claire noticed Margaret standing near the grand staircase, one hand still touching the sapphire pendant, her expression distant and contemplative. "Thank you for a lovely evening," Claire said as they prepared to depart. Margaret seemed to return from some mental journey, her focus sharpening. "You're very welcome, my dear. I hope we'll see more of you both in Newcastle. It's refreshing to have neighbors with substance." In the car, driving back through the still pounding rain, Sean exhaled deeply. "Well, that was illuminating." "And intense," Claire added. "There's definitely something simmering beneath the surface there." The Kerrigans have always had a reputation for being Complicated, Sean said, carefully navigating the slick roads. Old money, old secrets. That pendant was extraordinary, Claire mused. Worth millions, easily. Margaret Kerrigan's pride and joy, Sean agreed. She wears it at every significant social function. It's practically part of Newcastle folklore at this point. As they turned onto Sleve Donard Avenue, their headlights briefly illuminated a figure hurrying along the sidewalk. A tall, slender woman with a distinctive bob haircut, huddled against the rain. "Isn't that Ava Kerrigan?" Claire asked, surprised. Sean slowed the car, peering through the rain-streaked windshield. "It looks like her. What on earth is she doing walking in this weather?" "Should we offer her a ride?" Sean hesitated, then nodded, pulling the car alongside the drenched figure. Claire rolled down her window. "Ava, it's Claire Murphy. Would you like a lift?" Ava turned, her makeup smudged by rain and what looked suspiciously like tears. For a moment, she seemed startled, almost frightened. Then her usual mask of sardonic amusement slid back into place. "My knights in shining Audi," she quipped, already reaching for the back door. "Grandmother would be appalled at my unladylike exodus, but needs must when the devil drives. Or in this case, when one's mother cuts off one's Uber account." She slid into the back seat, bringing with her the scent of expensive perfume, rain, and the faint but unmistakable aroma of whiskey. "Where can we take you?" Sean asked, pulling back onto the road. "My flat is in the Harbor Apartments," Ava replied, attempting to wring water from her soaked hair. "Assuming I haven't been evicted since this morning." "Is everything all right?" Claire asked, concerned by the comment. Ava laughed, a brittle sound devoid of genuine humor. "Define all right. By Kerrigan standards, I'm having a minor setback. By normal human standards, I'm a complete disaster." "Anything we can help with?" Sean offered cautiously. "Unless you happen to have 50,000 pounds to spare, I rather doubt it," Ava replied. Then, as if realizing how ungrateful she sounded, she added more softly, "But thank you for the ride." Walking in these heels was proving to be its own special form of torture. They drove the rest of the way in awkward silence, finally pulling up outside the upscale Harbor Apartments overlooking Newcastle's marina. Before getting out, Ava leaned forward between the front seats. "A word of advice," she said, her voice suddenly serious. "Be careful around my family, especially grandmother." "What do you mean?" Claire asked. Ava's expression was uncharacteristically grave. "The Kerrigans aren't what they seem. None of us are." She pushed open the door, then paused. "And that pendant, it's not just a piece of jewelry, it's the key to everything." Before Claire could question this cryptic warning, Ava was gone, dashing through the rain toward the building's entrance. "Well," Sean said as they pulled away, "that was dramatic." "But concerning," Claire replied, thinking of Ava's tear-stained face and ominous warning. "What do you think she meant about the pendant?" Sean shrugged, though his expression was thoughtful. Could be the alcohol talking, or typical rich family dramatics over inheritance. Claire wasn't convinced. In her experience, particularly since moving to Mourne Heights, cryptic warnings often preceded genuine trouble. She thought of Margaret Kerrigan's calculating eyes, the subtle tensions between family members, and Ava's apparent financial distress despite her privileged background. "I have a feeling," Claire said quietly, "that we haven't seen the last of the Kerrigans or their complications." She had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. The call came at 6:37 the following morning, an ungodly hour for a Saturday. Sean fumbled for his phone, assuming it was the hospital, while Claire buried her head deeper under the pillow. "Dr. Murphy," Sean answered, his voice still thick with sleep. Claire felt him stiffen beside her, suddenly alert. "Yes, of course. When did this happen? I understand. We'll be there as soon as possible." By the time he ended the call, Claire was fully awake, watching him with concern. "What's happened?" "That was Catherine Kerrigan," Sean said, already getting out of bed. "Something's occurred at Thornfield Hall. She asked if we could come right away." "Did she say what?" Claire asked, reaching for her robe. "No, just that there's been an incident, and Margaret specifically requested our presence." Sean ran a hand through his disheveled hair. She sounded distressed, which, from what little I know of Catherine Kerrigan, is unusual. 20 minutes later, they were dressed and driving back toward the Kerrigan estate. The morning was gray, but no longer raining. the countryside shrouded in a light mist that gave Thornfield Hall an even more gothic appearance as they approached. This time, Robert Kerrigan met them at the door, his face pale and drawn. "Thank you for coming so quickly," he said, leading them inside. "Mother insisted on calling you, though I tried to persuade her that this is a family matter." "What exactly has happened, Mr. Kerrigan?" Sean asked as they followed him through the hallway. Robert hesitated, glancing around as if concerned about being overheard. "It's the pendant," he finally said, lowering his voice. "Margaret's sapphire. It's missing." Claire exchanged a glance with Sean, both remembering Ava's strange warning from the night before. "Missing?" Sean repeated. "As in stolen? That's the question, isn't it?" Robert replied grimly. "No signs of break-in, no strangers in the house, just family." He led them to the same drawing room where they'd gathered the previous evening. Margaret sat in her throne-like chair, still wearing her nightgown and robe, though her hair had been carefully arranged. Catherine stood beside her, immaculate despite the early hour in a tailored pantsuit. Liam slouched against the mantelpiece, looking as though he hadn't slept. Of Ava, there was no sign. "Dr. and Mrs. Murphy," Margaret acknowledged, her voice steady despite the evident strain in her face. "Thank you for coming. I apologize for the early hour." "Not at all," Sean replied. "Robert mentioned your pendant is missing?" Margaret nodded, gesturing to a small velvet box open on the table before her. "I removed it before bed last night, as I always do, placed it in its box on my dressing table. This morning, the box was empty." "Have you contacted the police?" Claire asked. "Not yet," Catherine answered, her tone suggesting this had been a point of contention. "Mother wanted to explore other options first." "I have no desire to subject my family to police interrogation if this can be resolved privately," Margaret explained. "The pendant is not just valuable monetarily, it holds significant personal and historical importance to our family." "Mother believes one of us took it," Robert added, his discomfort evident, "though why any of us would steal from our own family." "Please spare me your performative offense, Robert," Margaret cut in sharply. "We all know the financial pressures each of you faces. The temptation of a 19-carat cashmere sapphire would test stronger moral fiber than exists in this room." The blunt assessment hung in the air, met with stony silence from her children. "What exactly would you like us to do?" Sean asked carefully. "We're not detectives." "No," Margaret agreed, "but you are outsiders with fresh eyes. You met everyone last night, observed the dynamics, and," her gaze shifted to Claire, "you have expertise in valuable objects. I'd like you to help me recover my pendant without involving the authorities, at least initially." Claire felt uncomfortable with the request. "Mrs. Kerrigan, if you believe the pendant was stolen—" "I believe it was taken by someone in this house," Margaret interrupted. "Someone who attended dinner last night. I want to know who and why before this becomes a public scandal." Claire glanced at Sean, who gave a slight shrug. The decision was hers. While she understood Margaret's desire to handle the matter privately, involving themselves in a potential theft case seemed risky. "We'd need to ask some potentially sensitive questions," Claire said finally, "and everyone would need to cooperate fully." "Of course," Margaret replied, though Catherine and Robert exchanged a skeptical glance. "Where is Ava this morning?" Sean asked, noting the younger woman's absence. "That's part of the problem," Catherine said. "She's not answering her phone. No one has seen her since she left abruptly last night." The implication was clear. Ava was the prime suspect in the family's minds. "Before we jump to conclusions," Claire said, "perhaps we could see where the pendant was last seen." Margaret nodded, rising from her chair with dignity despite her nightclothes. "This way." She led them up the grand staircase to the east wing, where a set of double doors opened into a massive master suite. The bedroom was like something from another era: heavy damask curtains, a four-poster bed, antique furniture that had likely been in the family for generations. "My dressing table," Margaret said, indicating an ornate vanity near the window. Claire approached it, noting the careful arrangement of silver-backed brushes, crystal perfume bottles, and several jewelry boxes of varying sizes. The empty velvet box sat open in the center. "You're certain you placed the pendant in this box last night?" Claire asked. "Absolutely certain," Margaret replied. "I've followed the same routine for 40 years. Remove my jewelry, place each piece in its designated box, secure the clasps when needed. And who knew about this routine? Sean asked. Everyone in the family, Catherine responded. It's hardly a secret. Who had access to this room overnight? The family bedrooms are all in this wing, Margaret explained. The east wing is private. No staff enters without explicit permission, especially after the household has retired for the night. So any family member could have entered your room while you slept, Claire concluded. Theoretically, Margaret conceded, though I'm a light sleeper. Claire examined the jewelry box more closely. It was antique, lined with faded blue velvet, with a small, worn area where the pendant would typically rest, evidence of decades of the same routine. No signs of forced entry on the box, she observed. Was your bedroom door locked? No, Margaret admitted. I've never felt the need to lock my door in my own home. Claire glanced around the room, her conservator's eye automatically cataloging details. The bedroom windows were closed and latched. The antique hardwood floors didn't creak noticeably when walked upon. The four-poster bed was positioned such that Margaret would have her back to the dressing table while sleeping. What time did you retire last night? Claire asked. Shortly after you left, around 11. And you discovered the pendant missing this morning at 6 o'clock precisely, Margaret replied. I woke as I always do at 5:30. My morning routine includes prayer and reflection before dressing. When I approached my dressing table to prepare for the day, I found the empty box. And no one else has access to this room for cleaning or other purposes? Sean asked. No staff who might have seen the pendant. My personal lady's maid, Mrs. Collins, assists me in the evenings and mornings, but she had already left when I removed my jewelry last night, and I had not yet called for her when I discovered the theft this morning. Margaret's voice remained steady, but Claire noticed a slight tremor in her hands. We should speak with each family member individually, Claire suggested, starting with who was last to see Ava before she left. They returned downstairs to find Robert pouring himself a generous measure of brandy, despite the early hour. Liam had disappeared, and Catherine was speaking tensely into her phone near the window. Liquid courage, Robert, Margaret commented acidly as she observed her son's drinking. Medicinal purposes, mother, he replied, not meeting her eyes. For my nerves. Your nerves have been medicated since your 21st birthday, Margaret retorted. It hasn't notably improved them. Catherine ended her call and approached. Still no answer from Ava. I've left messages at her apartment building with the doorman. Nothing. And Liam? Sean asked. Gone to check Ava's usual haunts, Catherine replied. Though given her financial situation, I doubt she's at any of the upscale places she typically frequents. What exactly is Ava's financial situation? Claire asked, careful to keep her tone neutral. Robert and Catherine exchanged glances, seemingly reluctant to discuss family matters with outsiders despite having requested their help. My granddaughter has expensive tastes unsupported by actual income, Margaret stated bluntly. Robert has enabled her reckless spending for years, and now she finds herself in significant debt. Credit cards canceled, car payments overdue, rent in arrears. Mother, please, Robert protested weakly. Oh, spare me your embarrassment, Robert, Margaret snapped. The Murphys are here at my request to help find my pendant. False modesty about our family's personal failings serves no purpose. Claire intervened before the situation could escalate further. When was the last time each of you saw Ava last night? She stormed out after the incident with the coffee cups, Catherine said. Around 10:30, I believe. And no one went after her? Sean asked. Robert shifted uncomfortably. We assumed she'd gone to her room to sulk as usual. It wasn't until breakfast that we realized she wasn't in the house. Actually, Claire said carefully, we saw Ava last night. She was walking along Sleve Donard Avenue in the rain. We gave her a ride to her apartment. All three Kerrigans stared at her with varying degrees of surprise. What time was this? Catherine asked sharply. Around 11:15, Sean supplied. She said something about her Uber account being cut off. Margaret's expression tightened. Did my granddaughter say anything else during this drive? Claire hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. She seemed upset, mentioned financial difficulties. Did she say anything about me, about the pendant? Margaret pressed. Not specifically, Claire replied, deciding to withhold Ava's cryptic warning for now, just that she was having problems. Catherine's phone chimed with a text message. She checked it, her expression darkening. It's from Liam. Ava's not at any of her usual places, but her car is still parked at the Harbor Apartments. The doorman hasn't seen her since yesterday afternoon. That's concerning, Sean said. If she returned to her apartment when we dropped her off around 11:30, but hasn't been seen today. She could have left again, Robert suggested, though without much conviction. Taken a taxi somewhere. Or something could have happened to her, Claire pointed out, voicing what no one seemed willing to acknowledge. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Whatever suspicions the family might harbor about Ava's involvement in the missing pendant, her own unexplained absence now added a troubling dimension to the situation. Perhaps now would be a good time to contact the police, Sean suggested gently, both about the missing pendant and Ava's whereabouts. Margaret's hand tightened around the arm of her chair, her knuckles whitening. Not yet. First, I want to know exactly what happened in this house last night. She turned to Claire. You said you wanted to speak with each family member individually. Begin with Catherine. Though framed as a request, it was clearly a command. Catherine straightened, her professional demeanor firmly in place. I have nothing to hide, Mother. Then you won't object to speaking privately with Mrs. Murphy, Margaret replied. Perhaps in the library. Catherine nodded stiffly and led Claire from the room. Sean remained with Margaret and Robert, presumably to continue gathering information from them. The Kerrigan Library was impressive. 2 stories of floor-to-ceiling bookshelves accessed by a rolling ladder, leather armchairs arranged near a marble fireplace, and large windows overlooking the estate gardens. Catherine closed the heavy door behind them, the subtle click of the latch emphasizing their privacy.